in the cool January air of 215 BC, slowly cutting through the choppy winter waters just off the southernmost coast of Apulia, Italy, where the Ionian Sea meets with the Adriatic. The exhausted rowers below deck of 2 Roman triremes expressed deep thanks to the gods for their now easy pace, as they escorted a recently captured Macedonian light vessel called a lembos back to the main Roman squadron of warships. In the aftermath of what hours earlier had been a strenuously heart-pumping chase, wherein the lembos, upon coming into view of a powerful squadron of 5 Roman war vessels on the horizon, 3 large quinqueremes and those 2 triremes, had suddenly and curiously changed course, darting out to open sea instead of skirting along the coast as would have been expected, driving Publius Valerius Flaccus, the Roman admiral in charge of the squadron, to urgently bellow out commands to the captains of both triremes, pointing to the fleeing light craft, and head off in pursuit. With the lembos, despite a lengthy head start, although quick and maneuverable, and as much as it tried with only 1 rower per oar, whereas it may have been able to lose the much heavier and slower moving quinqueremes, it couldn't outmuscle nor outrun the top speed of the pursuing triremes, boasting 3 crewmen per oar. Also knowing that they had absolutely no chance of defeating the 2 nearing warships in a toe-to-toe fight, which forced the Macedonians to comply, now led back to where the rest of the Roman squadron were awaiting, where Flaccus from his flagship, surrounded by a strong guard of Roman soldiers, then boarded the captured ship, demanding to know their purpose and destination, when a man by the name of Xenophanes spoke up, a representative of King Philip V of Macedon, who explained to Flaccus that he had been on a failed diplomatic mission, aiming to present an alliance proposal to the Roman Senate at the behest of King Philip, even producing documents as proof to his claims, but that he had been forced to turn back due to the Carthaginians blocking the routes north to Rome, now returning to Macedon to report on his findings. At first glance, nothing appearing amiss to the Roman admiral, but still not enough to satisfy his nagging suspicions, due to the Macedonian ship's attempt at veering off into open sea, raising his hand to silence Xenophanes' ongoing explanations, while ordering several of his accompanying guards to begin a thorough search of the ship, that upon closer inspection revealed 3 passengers on board standing out from the rest, dressed in the likeness of Macedonians, but with noticeably different features. When addressed directly, speaking Greek, but with an undeniably heavy accent, and when searched, found to be in possession of documents that as soon as they were handed to Flaccus, caused his eyes to widen in alarm. A letter and a draft agreement, indeed outlining an impending alliance, with Philip V's name on it, but sent from Hannibal, bestowed by his Carthaginian ambassadors, that Flaccus immediately commanded, along with Xenophanes, to be cast into chains, transferred to the triremes, sailing off to Rome with all haste, while ordering another of his ships to make straight for the coast, where several riders would be dispatched, taking alternate paths, bringing the urgent news to Rome. Distressing information, much too important to be left to chance, nor one means of conveyance, needing to ensure that the Roman Senate was aware that, as of now, and in addition to Carthage, the Republic was also at war with the Kingdom of Macedon. Welcome to the Warlords of History podcast. I'm your host, Mark Pimenta. For this episode, now bringing us to part 7 on the series of Scipio Africanus, wherein I have to admit right off the bat that I initially intended to rush much more quickly through the events from where we left things off at the closing of 216 BC in Part 6, in order to get to Scipio's incredible campaign in Hispania, launched in 210 BC. However, the further I dove into the research in preparation for this installment, considering the sheer depth of the grave situation facing the Res Publica, in particular, the wild events in 215 BC, with the conflict spilling over into so many theaters outside of mainland Italy. As much as I'm chomping at the bit to get to Scipio's Spanish campaign, at the same time, another part of me felt that it would be a serious injustice to oversimplify or gloss over the truly fascinating events unfolding in the broader Second Punic War, that, as we'll find out more about in this episode, had sparked across the Mediterranean. Though also serving as an important element to our series on Scipio, since the events we'll be encountering herein all have relevance to not only Scipio's future, but Rome's evolution and future as well, including where it would focus its attention after dealing with Carthage. A future in 215 BC that was very difficult to see, its citizens uncertain if their republic even had a future. If not reduced to rubble, then pushed off its mantle, relegated to that of a minor player on the Italian peninsula. An undeniably grim outlook, made bleaker by the entry of two foreign powers joining into the fight against them, having struck alliances with Carthage, under Philip V of Macedon and Hieronymus of Syracuse, both of whom were eager to overrun the Republic's presence in their parts of the world. This, as Hannibal renewed his fierce campaign to conquer the cities of Campania in the spring of 215. And although meeting with an equally fierce Roman resistance there, after Hannibal shifted his strategic approach through the latter half of 215, the Romans finding themselves once again unable to prevent their genius adversary from widening his grasp over more of Magna Graecia, conquering almost all of Bruttium in southwestern Italy, making for an immense amount of pressure saddled upon the Res Publica, topped off by the appearance of two large invasion forces transported from the Punic capital that landed in Sicily and Sardinia, forcing the Roman Senate, despite its rather impressive and ongoing military buildup, to undertake a juggling act of epic proportions, dealing with a head-spinning amount of competing priorities and newly inflamed theaters of war. And that could have all spiraled out of control, worsening their plight, had it not been for some unexpected wins and forward progress in two battlegrounds outside of Italy. Victories that, alongside the successful defense of Campania, greatly helped to revive Roman morale, and the belief that, despite losing more ground to Hannibal in Magna Graecia, and the rise in new adversaries arrayed against them, assaulted on so many fronts, that all was not lost, and if they could continue to hang on, riding out the storm that was raging all around them, while building up its count of legions to never-seen-before numbers, Rome would be far from finished. However, before we dive headlong into these wild events of 215 BC, I'd like to take a moment for an important shout-out, since I have the immense pleasure of welcoming Shardan Radmanesh as the newest addition into the ranks of the Warlords of History Immortals. Thank you for supporting my efforts, with a wider thanks extended out to all the existing Immortals for your ongoing support of the Warlords of History podcast through either Patreon and PayPal, the links for which can be found on the support section of the Warlords of History website. Now, quick reminder that this episode marks part 7 of our series on Scipio Africanus. So if you haven't had the chance to have a listen of parts 1 through 6 yet, you might want to start with those first, in order to gain all the relevant context in view of what we'll be covering off in this installment. But nonetheless, as per usual, here's a summary of what we encountered in the previous episode to help bring you back as to where we last ended up. With Rome, through the latter half of 216 BC, mired deep in a dreadful state of despair, and much of Italy convinced that they were seeing out the final days of the Republic before extinguished, following in the wake of the Battle of Cannae, that unmitigated catastrophe for Rome, wherein, of the 86,400 soldiers they had brought to bear, aiming to crush the 52,000 strong Carthaginian army, stopping Hannibal's brilliant invasion of their homeland once and for all, astoundingly, only about 15,000 Roman troops managed to survive through the horrific ordeal and evade capture, in large part thanks to the heroics of the 20-year-old Scipio, who led the bulk of these survivors to the safety of nearby Canusium, leaving not only the blood-drenched fields of Cannae firmly in Hannibal's grasp, but also the Punic Empire as the most powerful state in the Western Mediterranean, with many of the cities of southern Italy immediately casting off their ties to Rome in favor of alliances signed with Hannibal. And yet, despite Rome's greatly weakened position, economically, politically, and militarily, its lifeblood, most literally, bleeding out profusely, Hannibal finding the Roman Senate staunchly defiant, unwilling to even listen to any of his proposed terms for peace, asserting, unequivocally, that only an outright Roman victory would bring an end to their conflict, while driving them to desperate extremes to raise new legions, in what would become the starting point of Rome's populace immersed into total war. But for now, with the Res Publica barely hanging on to what was left of its quickly eroding hegemony, desperately trying to pick themselves up off the ground after Cannae, only to be dealt another heavy blow from the second most powerful Italian city at the time, Capua, a mere 200 kilometers southeast of Rome. That too defected to Hannibal's cause, eager to replace Rome as the power broker on the peninsula, and from where the Carthaginian commander was poised to conquer more of wider Campania, had it not been for Scipio and the surviving troops from Cannae under the Roman general Marcellus that were marched in to reinforce the defenses of the key cities in the region, Neapolis, Cumae, and Nola, bolstered by 25,000 more Roman troops that arrived in Campania later in 216 BC, leading to a relative stalemate in the region as winter set in, coinciding with Scipio's return to Rome, where the young Scipio, the Senate, and the rest of its inhabitants were fully aware that they were at a critical juncture, caught in a crushing vice imposed by Hannibal, who, along with his field army in Campania, his Gallic allies to the north, and his newfound Italian allies in the south, were all pressing inwards, threatening to stamp out the Res Publica in between. A rapidly deteriorating situation that in 215 BC was about to become more grave, with the introduction of foreign powers entering the fray to the east and west of Rome, piling on when the Republic was at its most vulnerable. Leading us back to where we left off the storyline in the last episode, after Scipio's return to Rome, and how the Republic came to learn of the first of its new foreign enemies that had joined in the fight against them. Located to the east, across the Adriatic Sea, inland from what is today the Balkan and Greek coast, the resurgent kingdom of Macedon, under its young and aggressive monarch, Philip V, sparking a conflict that, while indeed linked to the Second Punic War, is usually labeled separately as the First Macedonian War. The Senate, having learned of this new adversary in early 215 BC, before Hannibal and his 40,000 strong field army set out from their winter stronghold on Mount Tifata, just to the east of Capua, resuming his campaign to conquer the wider region of Campania. When, as covered in the intro story at the very beginning of this episode, a squadron of Roman warships under the admiral Publius Valerius Flaccus intercepted a small Macedonian vessel that initially attempted to outrun the Romans, but was then caught just off the southernmost Apulian coast, at the bottom heel of Italy's boot. Discovering a Macedonian royal emissary on board by the name of Xenophanes. This in itself not an unusual finding, but upon closer inspection, hidden among the passengers, given away by their physical characteristics and thick accents when speaking Greek, a Carthaginian ambassador and his 2 aides. In possession of damning evidence, a letter and another document signed by Hannibal, detailing the terms of the Macedonian-Carthaginian alliance against Rome that was en route to King Philip for ratification, which, due to this wrinkle in their communications, delayed the official signing of the treaty until some point in the summer of 215. But with the Roman Senate, upon learning of this urgent news from Flaccus in perhaps late January or early February, cognizant to the fact that official ratification was just a matter of time, and for all intensive purposes, they were now at war with Macedon, greatly worsening what was already a dire situation, since Hannibal, months prior, after his devastating win at the Battle of Cannae, had ripped from their hands approximately 2/3 of Magna Graecia, topped off by stealing away their allies in Lower Samnium and Capua. And despite Rome managing to raise additional troops through the latter half of 216, reaching 40,000 in Campania, roughly equaling the count of the Carthaginian army in that area, the alarm among the Senate over Macedon's entry into the conflict was well warranted, being that not only were they losing the war against Hannibal badly, but they also now found themselves without adequate military resources to meet with this new threat, the scope of which was clearly outlined in the document Flaccus had taken from the Carthaginian ambassador, detailing the terms of their impending alliance with Macedon, one of mutual military cooperation against Rome. With Philip V intending to push westwards from Macedon, leading his army to conquer Illyria, all the way through to what would be the coasts of modern Croatia, Montenegro, and Albania, in the process eliminating the Republic's holdings and influence along these shorelines. And, as put forward by Livy in his work From the Founding of the City, once those conquests were completed, that King Philip should cross to Italy and ravage the coast, carrying on the war there by land and sea with all his might, directly providing Hannibal with Macedonian land and naval forces to aid in his endeavors against Rome, if not an invasion force led by King Philip himself, who was an ambitious, talented, and bold military leader, and after hearing about Hannibal's invasion, had started paying extremely close attention to the unfolding drama on the Italian peninsula. Following the evisceration of the Roman legions at Lake Trasimene in June 217, Philip then initiating communications, offering his congratulations to Hannibal as well. Communications that quickly accelerated, evolving into treaty negotiations after the Carthaginian general's comprehensive victory at Cannae, with Philip seeing the sharp decline in fortune that had befallen the Republic, alongside the surge of Italian allies that had defected from Rome, joining under the Punic banner. Since, according to Polybius in his work, The Histories, Philip viewed this as the moment to make himself master of Illyria, with the whole attention and all the resources of the Romans being concentrated on Hannibal and their decaying situation after the Battle of Cannae, seizing on this opportunity to continue rebuilding the Kingdom of Macedon, re-establishing its lost hegemony over the entirety of Greece, an ambition that Philip had been making impressive progress towards in recent years, but that he foresaw Rome as a future obstacle, a potent rival, standing in his way of realizing this fully. But let's turn back the clock a little bit in order to better understand what was going on here. Why go into such detail, you ask? Because, you see, Philip's actions here, from this point onward, essentially forced the Republic to maintain a vigilant eye on the political and military happenings further inland from the Illyrian coast, in order to keep a pulse on what other nations were up to, watching for potential future foes capable of threatening Rome's security and interests, spurring actions and interventions that Scipio too would become involved in, as we'll find out more about later on in the series, ultimately cascading into irreversible consequences, not only for Macedon, but the whole of Greece, and beyond, pulling Rome's attention further and further afield, deeper into the eastern Mediterranean. But forgive me, that's the future, when I meant to go back in time. Let's do that to get a better sense of what was happening with Macedon. A kingdom that had become a shell of its former glorious self. A once fiercely burning star whose fuel was quickly running out. Since the phenomenal rise of Macedon, engineered by Philip II from the 350s BC onwards, later taken to even greater heights by his son, Alexander the Great. Which, as a quick aside, in case you're interested, you can find a much more detailed account of Macedon's history in the first episode of the Warlords of History series on the astounding lifetime of Philip II, who laid the foundation for its meteoric rise. And although by Scipio's era it remained one of the more powerful Hellenistic nations in the eastern Mediterranean, what's absolutely clear is that it was no longer the dominant force it had been, now on the decline. Being that, after Alexander's conquests, having absorbed Achaemenid Persia and beyond into the folds of his vast empire that spanned from Greece to Egypt through to Central Asia and Northwest India. Upon his death in 323 BC, it immediately fractured into pieces that were taken and ruled over by his Macedonian generals and their successors, setting into motion a particularly violent, roughly 40-year period called the Wars of the Diadochi, otherwise known as the Wars of Alexander's Successors, all of whom were battling it out to expand their domains at the expense of the others. With the dust settling in the late 280s BC to leave four main Hellenic states standing: Ptolemaic Egypt, the massive Seleucid Empire spanning from Syria to Afghanistan, the Kingdom of Pergamum, located in Western Asia Minor, and finally the Kingdom of Macedon, coinciding with what is today northern Greece, the country North Macedonia, parts of southern Bulgaria, and Turkey's domains on the European continent. But given the split and near constant pace of warfare that had altogether seriously drained Macedon's resources, this also resulted in another major change to the political landscape, looking specifically on the Greek peninsula. In that, while arguably still the strongest military player in Greece and the Balkans, Macedon had been weakened to the point of no longer being the unquestioned master over that part of the world, though also attributed to the development of two major Greek leagues that had formed, the Achaean League and the Aetolian League. Confederations made up of various Greek city-states, pooling their military capabilities together in the effort to tip the scales and balance of power previously held by the traditional power brokers in Greece: Athens, Sparta, Thebes, and more recently Macedon, the membership of which changed with dizzying frequency, but by the onset of the First Macedonian War in 215 BC, included within the Achaean League, the majority of the city-states located in the Peloponnese, excluding Sparta, which remained independent. And in the Aetolian League, many of the states in central Greece, excluding Athens and Thebes, that too remained independent. I'll make sure to include a map on the Warlords of History website so that you can better see the configuration in Greece at this time. And for those of you familiar with ancient Greek history, probably of no surprise that it wasn't long before these powerful leagues began clashing with one another, repeatedly, then looking for outside muscle to help them win. Enter Philip V of Macedon, who, as related by Robin Waterfield in his book, Taken at the Flood, the Roman Conquest of Greece. As soon as he assumed the throne in 221 BC at the age of 16, Philip immediately established himself as a fiery Macedonian patriot, determined to guide Macedon once more to greatness. First, by successfully fending off Illyrian tribal raids on his kingdom, and once quelled, joining in and pretty much taking over the Achaean League in their war against the Aetolians, in a conflict called the Social War, fought over 3 years from 220 to 217 BC, wherein the young Macedonian king again proved himself a ferocious military leader, winning an impressive series of battles over the Aetolians and extracting territorial gains for Macedon before securing an uneasy peace in 217. But in the likeness of almost all Hellenistic kings that Robin Waterfield points out always followed an ethos of aggressive expansion, Philip not at all content with these early wins, making preparations to doggedly pursue his mission of re-establishing Macedonian mastery over Greece and the Balkans. In turn, with everyone in Greece and the Balkans wary as to where Philip would look next, as he continued rebuilding Macedon's military strength, assembling a professional standing army estimated to be in the realm of 30,000, the backbone of which were, as always, Macedonian phalanx heavy infantry, wielding 6-meter-long sarissa pikes. But also, interestingly, using the winter of 217-216 to build a fleet of 100 light warships, called lembos, or lemboi for plural, being that Illyria was next on his hit list, aiming to crush the various tribes and conquer their cities, using a dual-pronged approach, invading with his land forces from the west while his navy attacked their shoreline settlements in the east. However, acutely aware that this would result in a direct clash with the Roman Republic, due to, as touched upon back in parts 1 and 2 of the series, Rome's meddling along the coastlines of Illyria in the early 220s, their last incursion as late as 219 BC, before consumed with the war against Hannibal and Carthage. That was initially focused on stomping out Illyrian state-sponsored piracy on the Adriatic, but with the res publica then choosing to exert ongoing influence by declaring themselves as the protectorate over the various Illyrian tribes they had defeated in these endeavors, while maintaining small Roman garrisons and representatives in key locations, such as in the cities of Epidamnus and Apollonia on the modern Albanian coast. From Philip's perspective, however, all of this, an overt insult and threat, impinging on what he felt was squarely within Macedon's sphere of authority, further emphasized by Robin Waterfield when he writes, as far as Philip was concerned, the Romans constituted a threat to the Macedonian hegemony over Greece, and would have to be dealt with. Accordingly, foreseeing war with Rome, this presumptuous, budding rival as inevitable, and the circumstances in 215 BC now perfect, with Rome at its weakest, for Philip to join with Hannibal against them, while at the same time launching his campaign to begin conquering the eastern Adriatic, erasing Rome's presence, from where, afterwards, incursions could then be made into Italy, posing a significant hazard to Rome, That for now, the Senate could only respond to with a band-aid solution, sending the Roman admiral, Publius Valerius Flaccus, 25 more warships, doubling the fleet under his command, charged with safeguarding the eastern and southeastern Italian coastlines to a total of 50, while at the same time prowling the Adriatic, hunting for any Macedonian or Carthaginian vessels that appeared, trying to keep Philip and his forces confined to mainland Greece. But again, an imperfect, temporary solution, unable to free up any of its legions to send into this newly burning theater, being that its available forces were barely sufficient to keep Hannibal's 40,000-strong field army at bay in Campania, the area centered around the modern Italian city of Naples, or Napoli. In 215 BC, the region that would become the primary front lines of the Second Punic War, as Hannibal and his army emerged from their winter stronghold on Mount Tifata, just to the east of Capua, in the early spring, sometime in March, to conquer the nearby Roman allied cities Nola and the port of Cumae. Though, of note, foregoing any additional attempts on Neapolis, today Naples, due to the city's formidable fortifications, realizing that this valuable port would be too tough a nut to crack, and that the Romans, wisely, had strengthened with a large Roman garrison, which, of the 40,000 troops they had since installed in Campania, approximately half, under the general Marcus Claudius Marcellus, were being used to reinforce the defenses of all these cities, keeping them loyal to the Republic as well, with the other 20,000 placed in strong defensive positions at strategic choke points, blocking the main routes from Campania to Rome, only 200 kilometers away. And while this total count of Roman troops had been numerous enough to force Hannibal to call off his initial attempts at conquering Nola, Neapolis, and Cumae through the autumn and early winter of the prior year, creating for a stalemate in the region, his presence close by, protecting his key new ally, Capua, over the winter of 216 into 215, this had bought Capua the time they needed to begin mobilizing their own, rather impressive military capabilities. Based on various estimates, although possessing a full potential of up to 30,000 troops, well known for their quality cavalry as well, a more reasonable estimate at this early stage was that they were fielding about 20,000. Since Capua was expected to pull its own weight if they wanted to replace Rome as the future hegemon of Italy, not only in the defense of their own city, but with Hannibal also requiring them to participate offensively by conducting raids on the Roman contingents and on the lands around the Campanian cities Hannibal was looking to absorb into his growing anti-Roman coalition, which freed up the Carthaginian commander to first march his 40,000 soldiers to again, after his failed attempt months prior in 216, make another attempt on the port city Cumae, on Italy's west coast, facing the Tyrrhenian Sea, 20 kilometers west of Neapolis, aiming for a quick win, trying his luck at storming Cumae, rather than conducting a protracted siege, which did not at all go well for the Carthaginians, getting badly stung in the process. Because, although Cumae's fortifications were considerably weaker than that of Neapolis, the Romans, knowing this, had made sure to add more than enough troops to keep the city well in hand, resulting in Hannibal, smart enough to know when to cut his losses, nor waste time and resources against so well dug in a foe, after one particularly fierce assault, which failed, inflicting, according to Livy, 1,300 losses upon his forces, he decided to promptly march his army off, aiming for another target, the city of Nola, located much closer to his new supply base, 40 kilometers southeast of Capua, that enabled him to pursue a prolonged siege of the city, launched in the mid to late spring 215 BC. alternatively known as the Second Battle of Nola, following the First Battle of Nola, Hannibal's failed attempt in late 216, where the skilled Roman general Marcellus was directly overseeing the defense of the city, which led to the fight for Nola, evolving into a particularly nasty series of fierce skirmishes. Marcellus, repeatedly sallying his forces out from the city to bite at the Carthaginian encirclement, and then ordering them to fall back behind Nola's walls, withstanding Hannibal's counterattacks, which continued for approximately the next 2 months or so, causing considerable casualties on both sides in the low thousands, numbers that Livy says were higher for the Carthaginians, to the tune of around 4,000, numbers that Hannibal could ill afford to lose, driving the Carthaginian commander in the midsummer of 215 to abandon the siege of Nola, opting for a shift to his military strategy in and around Campania for the rest of that year, strictly using his troops for field operations rather than conducting any sieges or city assaults. Why is that? You'll probably recall this common theme that we've touched on repeatedly: Hannibal's lack of reinforcements, with the attempts on Cumae and Nola eating up his available manpower way too quickly, around 5,000 gone, with nothing to show for it. Moreover, keeping in mind that the sorely needed 20,000 North African troop reinforcements promised by the Council of Elders in Carthage had yet to be delivered to him on Italian soils, forming part of the equation for his strategic shift, but also because Hannibal had suddenly found himself once again heavily outnumbered in Campania, with more legions marching down the Via Appia, the road connecting Rome to Capua. According to Patrick Hunt in his book, Hannibal, giving the Republic 6 legions and an equal number of Italian allied troops in the region, nearly 60,000 troops in all, to that of Hannibal's field army that was now hovering at a strength of around 34 to 35,000. The Roman forces subdivided into 3 armies of 20,000 each, a common feature of their approach from here on in. One under Marcellus protecting the aforementioned Campanian cities, another stationed at the Casilinum Pass, just to the northeast of Capua, and the third army under none other than the delayer himself, Quintus Fabius Maximus, elected consul for 215, protecting the routes in northern Campania to Rome. Each of these alone insufficient for taking on Hannibal in a straight-up pitched battle. But that was never really their intent, scrubbed from the Roman playbook against Hannibal. Instead, fully embracing the Fabian strategy, furthermore, for the time being, intent on waging it purely in a defensive capacity, given what Andrew Lintott in his book, The Roman Republic, refers to as the res publica's primary objective at this point: to minimize its losses, with Rome's power in various regions under grave threat at the same time. Their entire situation at a crucial tipping point, unable to afford any further military calamities, nor lose additional ground to Hannibal, risking more damage to their already tarnished prestige. Otherwise, indeed, quite possible that some of its central Italian allies might defect to the side of the Carthaginian invader. All of this under Fabius's steady, guiding hand, who I think an appropriate characterization of his role was that he had donned the mantle of becoming the supreme commander of the Roman war effort in all but name. And not just in terms of his strategy of attrition, in a broader sense, transforming Rome's entire approach to the Second Punic War. Among its military leadership, instituting a system of orderly command, as mentioned by David Potter in Origin of Empire, with Fabius managing the electoral cycle to make sure that only men he could trust, well-seasoned and veteran consuls and generals, were placed in command of an army against Hannibal. Further evidenced by Edward J. Watts in his book, Mortal Republic, when he points out that for the next years, the uncommon instance of only certain men repeatedly winning Rome's highest offices. Two prime examples including Fabius holding 3 consulships between 215 to 209, and Marcellus holding 3 between 214 to 208, among other examples. Another feature of the transformation was for successful generals in the field, having their commands extended for years on end, named as proconsuls or propraetors, giving them more experience, thus improving the overall quality of the Republic's military leadership, and who were no longer taking any foolhardy risks with the soldiers serving under them. These citizen soldiers, who henceforth, out of necessity, were also required to remain in the army for much longer than one campaigning season or 1 year, yielding the byproduct of heightening their experience and fighting abilities. All of this in an effort to stem the flow of Roman blood and hold the line in Campania, while the Res Publica, in the spirit of total war as referenced in the last episode, continued driving for an unparalleled troop buildup, an overwhelming force, counting multiple times over anything Hannibal or Carthage could ever hope to field, but also recognizing the error of their earlier impatient ways, no longer taking any shortcuts with respect to the training of soldiers, fully returning to the practice of subjecting all recruits to the usual, grueling, 4-month-long training sequence at the Campus Martius to regain the sharpened, fighting edge of newly raised legions before let out from Rome. That I strongly suspect Scipio would have been involved in, having returned to Rome sometime in late 216 or early 215, and in all likelihood, given the demands of the war effort, that was all hands on deck, so to speak, participating in the administration and training of these troops, something he was well known to have excelled in. Later on, in his own campaigns, exerting fierce discipline over those under his direct command, while having them diligently trained and drilled to an exceptional extent. Accordingly, if not directly involved himself, at the very least, witnessing his city, that in the likeness of a living factory, began steadily churning out legion after legion. However, in pursuit of the incredible scale that they were working towards, understanding that this was a project that would take time, years in the making, and immense resources to achieve. Amidst, as emphasized in the last episode, the Republic's economy, dangerously flirting with financial insolvency, ongoing food shortages, and its earlier, eye-watering manpower losses, struggling to fill the ranks of the legions. That Patrick Hunt, in his book Hannibal, mentions forced the Republic to scour central Italy, sending officials to village after village, recruiting every able-bodied Roman and allied man that they could find, young and old, irrespective to their income or property class. This previous requirement to serve tossed out the window, which also forced the state to foot the entire bill of arming these troops, unlike previous generations. And while far from a smooth process, and not at all close to the total number they would eventually mobilize in the coming years, by the end of 215 BC, Rome managing to get a total of 12 legions on the ground, with a roughly equal number of Italian allied troops, somewhere between 100,000 to 120,000 troops active on the board, arrayed in blocks of 20,000 per army. And as much as they would have loved to throw all this at Hannibal, keeping him more tightly contained in Campania, the broader demands of the war in other theaters prevented this. With 20,000 soldiers sent north to Ariminum at the edge of the Po Valley, to replace the army that you might recall had been recently destroyed by the Boii Gauls at the Battle of Silva Litana. And another army of 20,000 sent across the peninsula to northern Apulia, in order to block any Carthaginian contingents or Hannibal's Italian allies from making any headway into central Italy. At the same time, acting as a reserve, situated along the southeastern Italian seaboard, should Philip V manage to land any Macedonian troops in the region. With the Senate, just when they may have thought that they had all their burning problem areas adequately manned, soon learning of yet more Carthaginian movements that sent alarm bells ringing in Rome, in what was about to become, beyond what was already happening in Italy and Illyria, a surge of newly burning theaters of war, engulfing much of the western Mediterranean. A veritable firestorm of competing priorities, making for a head-spinning demand and strain on their rebuilding military strength. The first of these being reports of a Carthaginian naval fleet in the late spring of 215 BC transporting an invasion force of 17,000 troops from North Africa, en route to the island of Sardinia, where Carthaginian agents had earlier been active, stoking discontent among the native Sardinians to throw off their Roman overlordship, who then rose up into active rebellion, with Livy explaining much of this having to do with the Republic requisitioning more and more grain from the native inhabitants that was then shipped off to the mainland in order to keep Rome from falling into famine, amounting to a serious threat to its food supply, especially given the fact that Rome only had a small garrison of about 2,000 troops stationed on the island, that undoubtedly would have been outgunned and easily swept aside by such a large incoming Punic wave, had it not been for, and luckily for Rome, a punishing late spring storm that blew the Carthaginian fleet terribly off course, severely delaying the arrival of that 17,000-strong Punic invasion, while gifting the Republic time enough to send a full army to Sardinia far in advance. The timing of which coincided with yet another stunning political setback for Rome, and the sudden opening of another war front in Sicily, as a result of the powerful foreign city-state Syracuse abandoning its long-standing alliance with Rome in favor of one signed with Carthage. When King Hiero II, who for nearly 50 years had proven himself a faithful supporter of Rome, in recent years doling out vast sums of financial and food aid to them in their desperate time of need, but well advanced in age in his early 90s, as mentioned by David Potter, Hiero finally succumbed to his old age at some point in the first couple of months of 215 BC, leaving the throne of Syracuse to his grandson and successor, Hieronymus, a youth of 15, guided by a council of nobles, who ambitiously and opportunistically, another strong possibility being so young, perhaps manipulated by the council around him, soon after assuming the throne, looking to use the Second Punic War to extract land gains for Syracuse, Hieronymus opened up negotiations with Carthage to see what they were willing to offer, while at the same time inviting Roman officials to see what they were willing to give up, in order to determine who would win Syracuse's help in the ongoing conflict. In essence, looking to extort the Republic when they were at their weakest, evidenced by the rather unpleasant and rude tone Hieronymus took with the Roman envoys, that Polybius reports quickly soured their discussions, especially when the young king laid down his terms, telling the Roman representatives that he would only honor the treaty they had made with his grandfather if Rome immediately repaid all the gold that had been loaned to them, also calling in the bill for the enormous quantities of grain that Hiero had supplied them over the last year, piling upon another insult, demanding that the Republic give up all their holdings east of the Himera River, which would have almost doubled Syracuse's territory, splitting Sicily almost right down the middle. And due to the insulting nature of the negotiations and Hieronymus's egregious demands, it probably comes as no surprise that the Roman emissaries abruptly stormed out of the talks, fully aware that a new adversary would soon be aligned against them, which was indeed formalized between Syracuse and Carthage at some point in the early summer of 215. According to Polybius, with the Carthaginians promising to assist Hieronymus with land and sea forces to expel the Romans from Sicily, dividing the island between them. And make no mistake, Syracuse was a vital game piece. Because, beyond Rome losing a critical source of financial and food aid, immediately worsening their situation, making their intended military buildup infinitely more difficult to carry out. Although a relatively small state compared to the likes of the Roman Republic, Carthage, and the Greek Hellenistic states to the east, Syracuse had the ability to punch way above their weight class in terms of naval strength, possessing a fleet estimated by some historians that may have included up to 100 warships, consisting of triremes and quinqueremes, giving them a seagoing strength close to being on par with that of Carthage. And that alongside Carthage and Macedon, altogether now posed a serious challenge to Rome's naval dominance on the sea lanes surrounding their peninsula. Because, you see, Syracuse, since founded by settlers from the Greek city-state Corinth in the 730s BC, throughout its nearly 500-year history up to that point in time, had always placed a great deal of emphasis on the maintenance of a powerful navy, vital for protecting its equally large armada of merchant vessels, the primary means through which it had evolved into one of the premier trading and commercial powerhouses of the ancient world. Furthermore, blessed with an abundance of natural resources, highly fertile agricultural lands surrounding the city, yielding huge food surpluses to their needs, along with copper, iron, and sulfur mining, all of which was exported abroad, propelling Syracuse, as emphasized by Patrick Hunt, to become one of the richest cities in the world, possessing tremendous stores of wealth in the form of precious metals, silver and gold. And because it didn't have the expenses of a large empire, instead spending lavishly on themselves, including exceptional harbor facilities, and on the beautification of the city, fountains, statues, opulent temples, and other public buildings, inside, adorned with all manner of masterpiece paintings and artwork. Moreover, well protected within the city's famed walls and fortifications, that Barry Strauss, in his book Masters of Command, mentions, surpassed even that of Rome, making Syracuse one of the great fortresses of the ancient world. And then lastly, there was its strategic location, situated in between important seagoing commercial routes that greatly helped Syracuse become a major hub for maritime trade in the Mediterranean, for the movement of goods shipped to and from the Greek East, but especially between Italy and North Africa, doubling as an important point, particularly from a naval military perspective, in the context of the Second Punic War and back to our time frame. Understanding that, as Barry Strauss goes on to highlight, this newly formed Punic-Syracuse alliance provided the Carthaginians with way stations to the Italian peninsula that their navy was previously lacking, beyond a direct entry point into Sicily, also granting them greater access to southern Italy, where Hannibal was, and their recently acquired southern Italian allies. Way stations that Carthage immediately put to use, shortly after prying Syracuse away from Rome's side, landing a large invasion force of 28,000 North African troops on the island, that alongside the modest land forces Syracuse had, that sadly we don't have any reliable estimates on their number, but probably didn't exceed 10,000 troops, nonetheless posed a dire threat to the Roman cities and holdings in Sicily, accounting for roughly 2/3 of the western portion of the island. That too formed part of the vital grain lifeline to keep mainland Italy fed. A threat to which the Republic, their legions already committed elsewhere, had no ready answer for, no additional manpower to throw into this newly burning theater, aside from the roughly 12,000 dishonored soldiers that had survived the Battle of Cannae that the Senate had previously sent to Sicily as a punishment, to serve out the entirety of the Second Punic War, however long it would take. And on the heels of these events in Sicily, turning now to southern Italy, more Carthaginian transport ships using Syracuse as a springboard to bestow the much overdue troop reinforcements that were finally delivered to Hannibal at the apex of summer in 215 BC. Arriving somewhere along the southern coast of Bruttium, the toe of Italy's boot in the southwest of the peninsula, the region today called Calabria, to meet up with a 5,000-strong Carthaginian detachment that Hannibal had peeled off from his field army in Campania, sending them south under one of his officers that also happened to be his nephew by the name of Hanno, who, to his ultimate surprise and palpable anger, certainly shared later by Hannibal, only found 4,000 Numidian cavalry and 40 war elephants stepping off the Carthaginian transports to join them, a mere fraction of the desperately needed 20,000 soldiers that had earlier been promised by the Council of Elders. And unbeknownst to Hannibal, though hopeful for more in the coming months and years, this allotment being the only reinforcements he would ever receive from the Punic capital. Begging the question, what drove the Council of Elders to shortchange their genius commander so severely? Now, part of the answer emerges from an event that we briefly touched upon in the last episode, when Hannibal's youngest brother, Mago, traveled to the Punic capital in late 216 BC to pour all those golden rings taken from the slain Roman elite out in front of the Carthaginian council, as a testament to Hannibal's unbroken string of amazing victories, requesting more North African troops be sent to help his brother finish the job. As impactful of a statement as that was, it appears that some of the military minds among the elders held a different opinion, perhaps linked to internal Carthaginian squabbling, being that the prominent Barca family, of which Hannibal was the head, certainly had their fair share of political opposition among other important families, wary of Hannibal and the Barcas gaining too much power. How much of this was weighing into their mindset, we can't say for sure, but regardless alludes to what may have been a growing disconnect between Hannibal and the Council of Elders in terms of their overall strategy for the war. In that, whereas Hannibal was convinced that the war had to be prosecuted in Italy to the fullest extent, fought and won there, in order to irreversibly isolate and relegate Rome to that of a nominal power on the Italian peninsula, perhaps, given the right conditions, even conquer the Republic outright. Another faction among the Punic aristocracy had become swayed by the frustratingly deep concern that despite its horrendous setbacks, unbelievably, Rome hadn't shown any signs of a willingness to negotiate at all, inferring a growing doubt that Italy could be fully taken by storm, nor the Republic cowed into submission, determining that, while occupied with and distracted by Hannibal in Italy, rather than pouring more of their resources there, better to open multiple theaters at once, forcibly retaking the domains lost to Rome after the First Punic War, Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. Explaining part of the reason behind the shortfall, but with the main reason they didn't send the full complement of 20,000 soldiers they had originally promised to Hannibal, was because of the mounting Carthaginian reversals that were happening in Hispania, requiring them to urgently divert reinforcements there. Courtesy of Scipio's uncle, Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Calvus, since 218 BC, later rejoined by Scipio's father in 217, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, that we renamed as Scipio Sr. The elder Scipio brothers, who had been presiding over a magnificent campaign, the one bright spot in the Second Punic War for the Republic, steadily beginning to dismantle the the hard-fought Carthaginian holdings in Spain, carved out by Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, that we covered in part 2 of the series. To which in Rome, the surprisingly positive reports emerging out of this front began acting as an immense source of hope for the populace, hungry for anything that helped them repair a measure of their terribly wounded pride and morale, to such a degree that Scipio Senior and Gnaeus were being lauded as heroes, and the dignitas of the Cornelii Scipiones greatly enhanced, that most important of Roman virtues associated with familial and the personal glory of everyone linked to that family. Something that, we can imagine, our Scipio would have undoubtedly felt and understood, and beyond a source of personal pride, perhaps also manifesting as extra motivation for him to emulate into the future. Now, when we last touched upon the events happening in Spain towards the late summer of 218 BC, this was when Scipio Senior, along with our Scipio, departed from the city Massilia in southern Gaul, rushing off to waylay Hannibal's forces as they emerged from the Alps, leaving the majority of his army and naval fleet in the hands of his brother Gnaeus, to begin attacking Carthage's recent acquisitions in the northeastern Iberian Peninsula, who, through the balance of 218, performed exceptionally well in this task, right away making an impressive impact, helped by the fact that Hasdrubal, Hannibal's younger brother who had been left in charge, overseeing to the defense of the region, was occupied far away in southwestern Spain, fighting tribal entities to expand the Punic footprint, which gave Gnaeus the breathing space to lead his army in from Massilia, and in rapid succession, overrun the modest Carthaginian land forces left defending the area, liberate the city of Emporiae in northeastern Spain, and then defeat a Punic naval fleet at the mouth of the Ebro River. By the spring of 217, enabling him to liberate the city of Tarraco, modern Tarragona as well, thereby re-establishing Roman dominance north of the Ebro, the preset dividing line between theirs and the Carthaginian spheres of influence in Spain. The point at which Scipio Senior rejoined with his brother, and from where they, together, began to push further southwards, beyond the formerly agreed upon boundary, at the head of just over 20,000 troops, accompanied by a fleet of 60 warships. Through 217 and into 216 BC, seeing so much progress and momentum in their endeavors that they managed to dislodge several notable Iberian tribes from their allegiance to Carthage, also gaining the service of an additional 5,000 local Iberian warriors, including light infantry and cavalry added to their army, while also coordinating actions with other tribal nations further afield. For example, Livy pointing out a sizable rebellion by the Turdetani, well within the Punic territories, and dangerously close to its wealthy silver mines in southeastern Spain, triggered by the elder Scipio brothers, that kept Hasdrubal tied up in the south, but that he finally managed to quell by the dawning of 215 BC, before leading a 25,000 strong army north, setting the stage for a major pitched battle between the Scipio brothers and Hasdrubal, called the Battle of Ibera, also known as the Battle of Dertosa, that took place in the late spring of 215, just south of the Ebro River, about 40 kilometers inland from the eastern Spanish coast, wherein, despite the numerical size of the opposing armies being almost identical, and the fighting fierce, inflicting heavy casualties on both sides, although we don't have any details on the actual numbers, it's reported that the Carthaginian army took the brunt of the losses and was almost entirely destroyed, with the Roman heavy infantry acting as the keystone for this crushing victory, but greatly helped by the Iberian light troops and cavalry protecting and fighting at their flanks. That, as a quick side note, proved an extremely effective tactical approach, with the elder Scipio brothers making greater use of and incorporating foreign auxiliary troops alongside regular Roman forces. That, interestingly, our Scipio would later mirror during his future Spanish campaign, including a brilliantly modified variation that he would employ to a devastating effect at the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BC, offering up a sneaking suspicion that Scipio may have somehow gleaned these valuable lessons, if not from personally witnessing Hannibal's army configurations and spectacular setups at the battles of Ticinus, the Trebia, and of course Cannae. Perhaps these insights were influenced or further galvanized, grounding his understanding on the important contributions of foreign light troops, instead of relying exclusively on the traditional Roman unit types, either directly from his father or uncle through correspondence, or another possibility, learning this indirectly from any of the veterans that had served under his father and uncle. The two men that, as a result of their resounding win at the Battle of Ibera, sent Hasdrubal retreating far south, to the city of Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, in order to rebuild his broken army, as Scipio Sr. and Gnaeus, through the summer of 215, continued their advance, 200 kilometers south, to reach and conquer the city of Saguntum, the city which had been the trigger point for the entire Second Punic War, defeating the small Carthaginian garrison within, while also forming a wider network of alliances with more Iberian tribes, greatly destabilizing the region, and, come to think of it, essentially mimicking what Hannibal had been doing to the Romans in Magna Graecia. Underscored by an important point relating to the broader conflict, perhaps best expressed by Robert Garland in his book Hannibal, when he says, "So by saving Spain, the Scipios had immeasurably assisted the situation in Italy." A notion that the historian Klaus Zimmermann takes even further when he cites that the elder Scipio's victory at Ibera may have well been the decisive battle of the war. Because not only did Scipio Sr. and Gnaeus prevent Hasdrubal, when Rome was at its weakest, from leading an army either by land or sea to join with his older brother in Italy, but, as mentioned earlier, this also drove the Council of Elders to urgently divert Hannibal's youngest brother, Mago, along with 15,000 troops to Spain. Not to mention several later Carthaginian expeditions as well, in order to preserve their possessions on the Iberian Peninsula, consequently depriving Hannibal of the reinforcements originally earmarked for Italy, leaving only those 4,000 Numidian light cavalry and 40 war elephants that were transported to the southernmost coast of the Italian peninsula, joining up with the 5,000-strong detachment under Hanno that Hannibal had peeled off from his army and sent south to Bruttium, today Calabria. And to make up for the shortfall, that was soon supplemented by a large contribution of Italian troops, collected from the towns and cities in Lucania and Bruttium that had allied themselves to Hannibal, in total giving Hanno a sizable force, in the realm of about 15,000 to 17,000 soldiers, that he immediately put to good use. Through the late summer and early fall of 215 BC, first marching them to the gates of the city Locri, that capitulated to Carthage, and then winning a minor engagement over the inhabitants of Crotona, modern Crotone, forcing the surrender of their city, as well as a number of other pro-Roman towns in Bruttium, through Hanno, now giving Hannibal total control over almost the whole of southwestern Italy, with the exception of Rhegium, the city at the extreme end of the mainland, that quite literally left Rome with only a toehold in the southwest. But possibly raising the question for you, why didn't Rome send some of its legions to help defend these cities, like they had successfully done in Campania? In short, they simply couldn't, due to Hannibal's evolving strategy that, as all the greatest of commanders do, he adapted to fit with the changing environment, in order to extract the utmost advantages possible. After calling off his failed second siege of the city of Nola months prior, in the early summer months of 215, a decision also influenced by the arrival of more Roman troops in the region. For the remainder of the year, the Carthaginian commander made no further attempts to capture cities himself. Instead, focusing on using his now roughly 30,000 strong army to do what they did best, conduct operations in the field, parceling them out into smaller detachments spread throughout Campania, concentrating on disrupting the supply lines, feeding the large Roman armies situated in and around the cities they were protecting, while hunting for smaller Roman units, out doing things like foraging and reconnaissance. As the battle for Campania, through the late summer and autumn of 215, exploded into a series of skirmishes all over the region, fierce, repeated raids and counter-raids. For the most part, whenever Roman forces came into contact with Carthaginian contingents, especially those led directly by Hannibal, the vast majority of these encounters won by the Punic troops. And while we can only guess at the casualty rates, although the broader consensus among historians seems to be that the Roman losses were heavier, these clashes undoubtedly were eating away at the Punic numbers as well. Granted, as effective as Hannibal continued to be, there was only one of them and couldn't be everywhere at once, alluding to a nagging problem for the Carthaginian general in his newly adapted strategy. The Capuans, participating and coordinating with Hannibal in these efforts, but acting separately under their own leadership, while raiding and doing their part to chew away at the Republic's supply lines. Whenever they tried to stand toe-to-toe with the Roman forces, the bulk of these encounters going horribly awry for the Capuans, regularly on the losing end, simply outclassed by those they were looking to replace as hegemon of Italy. For example, Livy, of several clashes recorded, citing one instance in particular, wherein the Capuans had established a military camp with 14,000 troops inside, near Cumae, from where they were harassing the city and the surrounding lands. Then, taken by surprise, when Roman forces launched a night attack on their encampment, so devastating that along with the Capuan commander, 2,000 of their troops were slain and 1,000 captured, at the cost of less than 100 fallen Roman soldiers. But nonetheless, even with these setbacks, Hannibal's revised strategy working like a charm, since this had made it practically impossible for the Republic to move any large bodies of troops further south from Campania, into Lucania or Bruttium, otherwise risk becoming isolated, potentially forced into a set-piece battle against Hannibal, which he was trying to tempt them with, but that they were avoiding at all costs. Moreover, providing the vital space and freedom for Hanno to conduct his operations in the southwestern extreme of the peninsula without Roman interference, resulting in the aforementioned Carthaginian conquests of Locri and Crotona in Bruttium. Impressive gains that continued well on the way of not just consolidating, but expanding Hannibal's hold over more and more of southern Italy by the early winter of 215 BC, before the campaigning season came to an end, once again occupying his mountain stronghold at Tifata, overlooking the city of Capua, where he had much to celebrate, in addition to capturing almost all of Bruttium, adding these cities and towns to his Italian coalition, having also played a central role in convincing foreign heavy hitters, Macedon and Syracuse, to join into his fight to bring the res publica to its knees. Remarkable successes, however, held back from gaining more momentum, due to that major ongoing impediment perpetually weighing down the strength of his campaign in Italy: the availability of seasoned reinforcements, not just to replace the losses in his army, but increase their count, especially in view of the scale of the buildup that Rome was pursuing. One potential source of reinforcements that may have held some promise for Hannibal being the troops that the Council of Elders had committed to other theaters, such as those sent to Spain and Sicily, which, if they won there, would free them to afterwards join him in Italy. A thought that Hannibal perhaps shared concerning those sent to Sardinia. Rather, better said as used to share. Because by the time Hannibal retired to Mount Tifata for the winter, this 17,000 strong invasion force sent to Sardinia had since been wiped from the face of the earth. How did that happen? Well, remember when I mentioned that late spring storm that delayed their invasion? This resulted in the Carthaginian fleet being pushed all the way back to the Balearic Islands, with many of their vessels severely damaged, requiring extensive repairs before seaworthy again, burning through over 3 months of precious time before those 17,000 Punic troops were finally transported to Sardinia, much later than anticipated, in the early autumn of 215 BC. However, by that time, much had changed on the island, with the Republic sending Titus Manlius Torquatus at the head of a full army that, along with the meager defenses they had previously stationed there, gave him about 23,000 troops in all, at the ready, far in advance of the Carthaginians. Torquatus, the same person who you may recall from the last episode, gave that harsh speech denouncing the Roman soldiers who had surrendered towards the closing of the Battle of Cannae, discouraging his fellow senators from paying the ransom Hannibal was asking for their release, thus condemning them to a life of slavery. And beyond his harsh ways, Torquatus ended up being quite the wise choice to lead the Roman army in this theater due to his familiarity with Sardinia, having served there several times over in the past 25 years. In fact, playing a key role in Rome's original conquest of the island, wresting it from Carthaginian control as far back as the First Punic War. And as soon as he returned to Sardinia, quickly and ruthlessly stamped out the native rebellion prior to the arrival of the Punic invasion force, that then culminated in the mid-autumn of 215 in a heavily one-sided encounter called the Battle of Caralis, fought in a river valley just outside what is today the largest city on the island, Cagliari, where the Romans absolutely crushed the Carthaginian army, greatly helped by Torquatus's superior knowledge of the geography that, Livy explains, enabled the Roman general to surround the Carthaginians by the way of a devastating flanking maneuver through the Sardinian landscape, and thus the battle turning into a slaughter for the Carthaginians, up to 13,500 of which were slain, with the rest taken prisoner. And of utmost importance, ensuring that the grain supply from Sardinia continued to flow to Rome uninterrupted, while also denying the Carthaginian navy of yet more bases from which attacks could have been made along the western coast of mainland Italy. A much-needed victory for the Republic that, alongside the elder Scipio brothers' impressive campaign in Hispania, was, although maybe not yet fully understood nor felt by the Romans at that point in time, was beginning to show the slightest of hints of relieving the terrible pressure of their situation in Italy, where Hannibal, despite gaining a serious amount of allied troop support from Capua, had been unable to overcome the Republic's robust defenses of the cities in Campania. That, at the same time, prevented him from making any inroads north into central Italy, or inch any closer to the Eternal City. All of which, in addition to helping improve Roman morale from its low point after the Battle of Cannae, began producing glimmers of hope that their strategy to slowly constrict Hannibal and his army was indeed the right one. However, important to note that their survival was far from assured, something I believe the Romans acutely recognized at this point, given the dangerous adversary still situated on their very doorstep, further emphasized by the fact that Sardinia and Spain were the only theaters in which the Romans were seeing forward momentum, where the fortunes of war, as would become later evident in Spain, could change on a dime. Moreover, standing in contrast to Sicily, Illyria, and most importantly, what remained unquestionably their dire situation in Italy, where they were just holding on, operating purely on the defensive, surrounded by a growing number of serious threats that they had no ready answer for, and that, under the right circumstances, could all potentially spiral out of control. Since Rome, yes, had successfully defended Campania, but what continued to elude them was a decisive answer to Hannibal's genius, even when outnumbering his field army so heavily in a region, remaining outplayed by the Carthaginian commander, who, despite only receiving a fraction of the reinforcements promised by the Council of Elders, still figured out a way to render the Republic powerless to stop him from gaining control over more of their peninsula, conquering almost the whole of Bruttium in the southwest. With Hannibal, from his winter quarters on Mount Tifata, now poised to capture yet more of Magna Graecia, looking to the southeast. A major factor behind that objective, driven by the need to gain an Italian port facing Greece, in coordination with Philip V of Macedon, who was marching his forces nearer to the coast, from where they could be much more easily transported across the Adriatic to Italy. This, while Syracuse and Carthage were on the eve of launching a separate campaign to overrun all of Sicily, meaning for the Republic glimmers of hope amidst a series of grave threats, many that could still tip them into an inescapable collapse. But for them to turn their hope into something more tangible, real belief, real success, turning the tide of the Second Punic War, with so many theaters across the western Mediterranean aflame, they would need to hold on for longer, while building up their legionary count to unfathomable numbers, before they could start hitting back. In the next episode, we'll continue with unpacking the fascinating events of the broader Second Punic War before centering the story back on Scipio, through 214 BC and into the following year, as the Republic continues the immense scale-up of its military strength, despite ongoing economic woes, getting some unforeseen aid along the way, helping them to, unbelievably, almost double their count of legions from that of 12 in 215 BC to 22 legions mobilized by the end of 213, fielding some 220,000 troops between them and their allies, and not stopping there. However, continuing to avoid direct collisions with Hannibal, focusing on punishing and weakening the resolve of his Italian allies, inch by inch, starting to claw back the northernmost domains of Magna Graecia, helped by some rather fortuitous events outside of Italy, one of which, a strategic raid in Illyria that forced Philip V of Macedon to destroy his newly constructed naval fleet, inhibiting the likelihood of him getting any aid over to Hannibal. While in Sicily, another unforeseen gift landed on Rome's lap that would render the Carthaginian invasion toothless, and Syracuse alone, besieged by Rome. The tide of the Second Punic War beginning to visibly turn in Rome's favor, yet still not having an adequate solution to stop Hannibal from a series of impressive conquests in 213 BC, gaining control of a number of important cities in southeastern Italy. The timing of these events coinciding back in Rome with Scipio's return to the forefront of our story, how the 23-year-old Scipio, although much too young to be eligible, leveraged his growing popularity and charismatic ways to win his first public office. And then, when Scipio's father and uncle were both killed in Spain in 211 BC, with Carthage regaining the initiative in that theater, pushing the Romans all the way back across the Ebro. How Scipio expertly maneuvered through internal Roman politics and objections from the older guard, men including Fabius, to secure his first command at the age of 26, assuming control over the Roman forces in Hispania. This and more to come in the next episode of the Warlords of History podcast. And in the meanwhile, if you want to support the podcast, there are many ways you can help. You can tell your family and friends about the show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you happen to access the show on. You can follow the podcast on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. And lastly, you can head on over to the show's website, warlordsofhistory.com, where on the support section of the site, you can find the show's Patreon or PayPal links in the event you want to contribute to the podcast directly. But beyond this, where I'll include some additional info, like images and maps pertaining to this episode for your viewing pleasure. And where you can also reach out to me with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions. I would love to hear from you. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the episode. Theme music from audionautics.com. Sound effects from zapsplat.com.